Okay. Hello, and welcome to Following Mechanical Turks project. This is episode 80. We've been doing this over 5 years at this point now. Today we have a special guest scholar. I'll have Nathaniel introduce him. Currently, right now where we are, we've been working with our third product in the project. So in our first product, we were looking at quantitative text mining of actual posts on Amazon Mechanical Turk itself. In the second product, we moved into essentially some survey measures where we were making posts on Mechanical Turk focused around concepts we had uncovered in the first product, mostly dealing with readability. Which seemed to be a common but complex term on Amazon Mechanical Turk, because it would range from the kind of implicit readability we would think of in terms of like a document, but it also stretched to accommodate things like making judgments about pictures. So, is this car totaled? Is sometimes a question of readability, at least in the language of MTurk. So from there, we've moved into this third product. We've been brainstorming and potentially starting to outline. We've been sort of orbiting around this concept of artifice, as we've talked about in the last couple of meetings. The notion that in artificial intelligence, that the qualifier artificial, as Nathaniel and I have been talking about, it has this kind of interesting, potentially humanist baggage where it seems to be sort of a negative for most of the sort of large poles in this conversation. It's not clear if we're talking about the same thing, but the idea of artifice either is something that delegitimates, right? It's like, well, this isn't what humans can do. It's artificial, it's fake. Kind of a Platonic notion. But then, other viewpoints, of course, it's not just two, but other viewpoints that argue for sort of the effect of artificial intelligence still, in a sense, see the notion of artifice as a limitation. And in particular, we were looking at the way that manifests in things like recursion, right? The idea that if a model needs kind of perpetual human interaction to keep it within the guardrails, that's seen as a less perfect system, because it's like, well, it's not truly autonomous, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it still needs this kind of buffer or structure around it. That's seen as a limitation. So what we've been kind of scratching at is the sort of rhetorical notion of leaning into artifice, that potentially all acts of cognition or communication are artificial, require a structure, right? Despite potentially a sort of hardcore Platonism, nothing is probably ever really an island. It's never ever truly autonomous. Even Plato accepts that. I mean, he understands that language is not wholly internal, and his perspective is more complicated than sometimes we give him credit for, and it's not clear what's his and what's his evolving thinking. It's tough to untangle. Anyway,
yeah.
Well, I'll stop. That's kind of where we are, and why we've come to our special guest to try and get our feet under us, thinking about these concepts of artifice. Nathaniel, I'll let you take it.
Yeah, so we're really pleased that Professor Seth Perlow is with us. Associate professor at Georgetown University in the Department of English, but also is faculty in American Studies and also Film and Media Studies. And one of the things we as we were kind of talking about what we might be interested in thinking through, his book, The Poem Electric Technology in the American Lyric, speaks some of these issues. He had a great, I still want to say recent, but in terms of there's academic recent and then there's newspaper recent, but a piece on AI and poetry, and making a really interesting argument that poetry itself is sort of partially a kind of algorithmic process. But then also, Seth, it'd be interesting to hear you talk about the current book project, which is about the literary handwriting analysis and electronic media, which I think tentatively titled The Digital Hand, which is potentially of interest. So I guess kind of just as an opening softball question, sort of what's your sort of, not, I guess, take, but how you see your own work in relation to this kind of larger conversation about intelligence, but particularly intelligence when it bears upon acts of reading and writing, right?
Yeah, great. It's funny because I've written a few things now about AI in one way or another. The Washington Post piece. This spring, I contributed a piece to the Critical Inquiry blog that was about large language models and returning to the questions broached in Against Theory, that influential article from the 80s by Stephen Knapp and Walter Ben Michaels. But really, my sort of work on AI began as teaching about AI. I mean, I'm always sort of thinking about what can I do for the Film and Media Studies program here at Georgetown. Media Studies sort of being my secondary field, because I'm really, I sort of think my move or my wheelhouse is to do media studies related work in poetry and poetics. And so I thought, a few years ago, it must have been maybe it was 2020, 2019, like, oh, let me try and put together a class. It turned out to be called Cultures of Artificial Intelligence. The culture's there, I guess, an effort to signal that it's not a technical practicum. I'm not a coder. But I did a bunch of background research to try and do a decent job with this class. And from that, they tell you that your teaching is supposed to drive your research. I kind of think that it doesn't work out that way all the time, but in this case, it sort of did, actually. And so the design of the classes sort of led me to do some writing and thinking about AI in a research capacity also. But it's also left me with some questions about the connections between what's happening in AI and humanities scholarship about AI and my other research. And as you sort of anticipated, Nathaniel, one area is actually could be thought of as having to do with readability, as you two have started, and some of your other guests have started to unpack it. This book project that I'm currently working on, The Digital Hand, is the subtitle, I think, is currently something like Electronics and Literary Manuscripts, right? The real fundamental driving question is, what is the sort of status of handwriting and of manuscripts in the the predominantly computerized environments where people are reading and researching and producing humanities scholarship today? And so I'm thinking about the sort of fetishistic attitudes that we often have towards handwriting, whether that's the handwritten work of an Instagram poet or the handwritten work of Emily Dickinson. But also I'm thinking about the question of the readability of handwriting. And you two probably have some amount of hands-on experience with the fact that computers are really not very good at reading handwriting. They're getting better. But my own practical encounters with the fact that computers just aren't great at reading handwriting led to sort of a deeper insight, which is that people who are interested in handwriting, going back at least to the mid-19th century, attribute to whatever is handwritten certain like qualitative or impressionistic facts that are, I would say, like in computational spaces, unparsable, precisely because they're often framed as against the quantitative or the distinct, right? It's in the handwritten that we find an affective energy or a certain kind of literary je ne sais quoi that is intentionally and specifically pitted against a more quantitative or scientific episteme that would be legible to a computer. So these questions about the horizons of readability are definitely active in the book project, both from a sort of technical and practical point of view, and also from a more theoretical point of view. Yeah, maybe I'll shut up there. I mean, there's obviously more. These questions about artifice is very interesting to me also. Yeah.
Well, Well, in part because, I mean, that's when our first piece is how do you, or can you disentangle, right? When we're talking about readability, we're both describing a sort of technical act around legibility, but readability also is, I mean, these hits would be like, is this car damage? Can you transcribe this receipt? How does this passage make you feel?
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And those are all, they're all reading. So, right. So how to even parse the technical aspect of it from some other theoretical or aesthetic aspect becomes really hard, right? You'll think like we need humans both because they can conceptually wrap their head around affect, but
Right.
also their eyes can do things that scanners can't do yet, right? They're also more technically competent, right? So this was also, we were doing this during COVID. And so the notion of what counted as a what was essential worker,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Were the polls, right? You need doctors and warehouse, right? But everything else, like these, so it inversed what skills were more valuable. I mean, it didn't actually inverse it because nobody was getting paid any different. So it didn't
Right.
actually value the labor any differently. We knew it was more important, but we still wanted to pay nothing for it. Yeah. And then, yeah, I lost the thread there.
There's
But
I mean, among other things, there's a kind of a logic of or maybe a sort of a shifty logic of supplementarity at work in the in what sorts of things does it seem that a human needs to step in and do, right?
yeah,
Maybe have a feeling is one of them. I mean that, I don't know. But also, as you say, like read this weird crumpled receipt or evaluate the damage on a car or just like identify a fire hydrant, apparently.
yeah, apparently, yeah.
And, you know, a story can be told. You guys probably know this book, Surrogate Humanity, by Neda Atanasosky and Kalindi Vora, I think is the second author's name.
Yes.
Really good book, and talks about Mechanical Turk and certain other again logics of supplementarity where humans are positioned. I mean, you can tell a story that's, you know, broader and has to do with the development of labor politics in the Bay Area and this sort of techno-utopian, techno-dystopian rethinking of the place of the human, where this kind of supplementation comes from.
Yeah, there's a really great, there's another, and now I'm going to blank on the names, but it was called heteromation, which is this notion of really nothing's ever automated. You just, you move things around. So they were looking at content moderation. They were looking at people that mod video games, but then also like ATMs and self-checkouts, where like the self-checkout doesn't replace a human. It literally replaces the human.
Yeah.
You're the teller now, right? There's still a human as a part of this. It's just they've offloaded the cost of the human, but there's still a human, right? The human just keeps getting moved. And that, I mean, that's, I think even that, I think the piece that probably you wrote like 11 years ago that was on the e-girl, and then you kind of unpacked like there's actually like like there's still humans there. They're just now they're off site somewhere. And so there's also kind of interesting sort of digital labor kind of thing there that's also.
Yeah. I mean, the factory labor, and I mean, this does start to shade into questions about what it means to want something that's artificial or want something that's not artificial, something that's more natural or more intuitive. You know, I argue in that article that there's a sort of an abiding desire or maybe fantasy about smoother and more natural ways of interfacing with computers. I mean, the central example is the iPhone, right? And the idea that like the part of the excitement of a touch screen phone was and is that it would be sort of more naturally interfaced, more intuitively interfaced with our bodies than buttons are. But there's this other, I mean, the move of the article, as you know, is like there's this other scene of gestural interfacing with iPhones, which is on the factory floor where human bodies and human gestures are like much more rigorously disciplined. So yeah, I mean, like what it means to desire something intuitive and not artificial, and the sort of like the politics that are implicit in, including the labor politics that are implicit in a desire for a more intuitive, more naturalistic, less artificial or structured human-computer interface, is a sort of complicated question there, in part because if you think in terms not only of the scene of consumption or computer use, but also the scenes of production, it becomes easier to say whether you want something intuitive or natural versus, what does it mean to want a less artificial factory floor? Like, that's not even a coherent idea, I don't think.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and something we bump into is, if we see those as opposed, natural or intuitive, it appeals to some semi-stable notion of what those are, right? What does intuitive mean versus the artifice of the keyboard? Right? Is the touchscreen more intuitive? And so, it doesn't. In some respects, it doesn't solve our problem, because it's like, well, now we just have to unpack where that what intuitive means, and is that predicated on something that is actually stable and inherent wherever that resides, biology or wherever,
right?
Or is it, just another kind of term in flux, potentially drawing its identity from its opposition to something like artifice?
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe this is a reasonable way into the this question about artificial intelligence. And I mean, I have to say, I really love the phrase artificial intelligence.
Oh, it's just
like at some level, I want to find out who coined it and like punch them in the face. Like there's just something about it that's like,
but also shake their hand for like,
it's very generative in this very way.
President, you called it Turks, already fantastic, and then artificial. You realize there's like a whole swath of academia that was just like, for the next year and a half, this shit's going to write itself.
Absolutely. So, I mean, okay, so let me go backwards into that. Like, I think that, Jeremy, what you were saying, like about the grounding of the idea of the natural or the intuitive, and the problem of its grounding, that is produced or out of any appeal to the natural or the intuitive, sort of led me to this question as I was thinking about like artificial intelligence. What does that mean? To this question of like, well, what is natural intelligence, right? And I think, I mean, if there were such a thing, I think my best answer to that question would be that natural intelligence is something like instinct. It's some kind of cognitive behavioral matrix that we would regard as not actually rational, and possibly not as actually intelligent, but rather as basically the animal part of the right. A natural intelligence would be like what drives the behavior of squirrels or something like that. And I'm not sure that within the ambit of within the discourse of artificial intelligence, that's really what's meant by intelligence mostly. And instead, I bet you guys would probably just agree with this, but like I instead think that the notion of intelligence, such as it is deployed within the discourse of artificial intelligence broadly, is inherently artificial. Like I mean, there's obviously, I mean, you invoke Plato, and we could go back that far, but like there's a very long history of recognizing that there is artifice in the project of human rationality, right? Basically at a fundamental level. So like, what does it even like? Is artificial intelligence tautological at some level? Maybe, actually.
Yeah.
Right? And then to finally get to, I mean, I was really thinking artificial intelligence at a weird level. It works almost like a double negative. Artificial intelligence. Because what it's really saying is natural intelligence. That's what artificial intelligence is. It's human intelligence. It's like very strange, but it also manages, and this goes back to the politics of supplementation. Actually, it manages to smuggle into that sort of double negative predication of human intelligence a little barb of derogation. It is a derogatory designation for human intelligence. Right. It's almost, I was thinking, what's an analogy for this? the analogy that I could come up with, sometimes when I go to a restaurant, I'm going to order a burger. I want to be a little maybe better to my body or the environment or something. So I order like an Impossible Burger or whatever. And, you know, like the nicer restaurants, they don't just have this like black bean burger junk. It's an Impossible Burger and it tastes better. I have to say, for me, it tastes better. Right. But sometimes they have Impossible Burger on the menu and you order it and it's a Boca Burger. It's like an old school, not as good regular veggie burger. So what is that? That's artificial meat, right? Which is just it's a terrible veggie burger. And so there's something about like the second artificial. What I want is real artificial meat. And in the
right, yeah.
At a certain level, that's what I guess that's what Jeff Bezos wants is real artificial intelligence, so he doesn't have to pay anybody anything for this. So there's something derogatory, is what I'm trying to say, in the second artificial, and it's a derogation pointed at human brains.
Yeah.
Oh man, I mean, first of all, the veggie burger analogy is that's spot on. I did not introduce it. Seth also does publish poetry, which was
been a while, but I'm trying.
Which was that poetic mode emerged there with that analogy, I think. Jeremy.
Well, the notion of supplementation, and the role of the human, because I didn't mention this, but the other main concept that popped out of the first piece we did, and we intentionally state in the second one, we're not dealing with this one, and here's why, is trauma. Mm-hmm. So the things that humans were good at, as far as we could see in the language, was readability, they can read stuff, and trauma, they can suffer. It's like, and it was interesting for us in part because of things like the IRB, right? Where it's like, to be a human, you have to be at risk. That's what we care about, right? How are you at risk?
So can you frame trauma for me? Is that like content moderation, or like what are you putting under that?
It mostly seemed to be things like questionnaires about cancer survivors, people who'd had trauma, because a lot of what we were looking at were surveys. So it's like, if you've been through a traumatic experience, we want your information, right?
Gotcha.
But there's this interesting kind of, something that's valuable or indicative of the human is it suffers in particular ways, and you need it to be able to espouse that, right? You can't really, maybe never, I don't know, ask the machine, but what's it like when a human has cancer, right? I mean, like, it could collate the data, but we may never be willing to grant it, but you don't know that. You're just stitching together stories you've heard. You couldn't possibly have had a loved one. You couldn't have gone through it yourself, right? Humans have this insight into human suffering, that may be characteristic in certain ways. Which
is one thing we noticed too, is that, and to a certain extent, that could get tucked under readability, because the term that we were using, and that is still one of my favorite terms, is the term telling, which means both to, like, I can tell that you're upset, and then I tell you a story, and then I have a tell in poker, right? It's this term. So that part of what readability is in a lot of digital spaces, it's human beings rendering themselves readable, visible to the machine.
Right.
So they're both generating readability and sort of performing readability. There was the article that came out about this time was like, I told Amazon Turk my most horrible personal story for 50 cents. Like, it was this, right? That kind of, so it's this whole notion of readability is also both a receptive act, but also being able to generate readability.
That article also was about academic practice. It was academics using Mechanical Turk and, potentially kind of unintentionally invoking trauma with, things like, social surveys,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it's like, I had to relive being assaulted for 50 cents,
Yeah, the phenomenon now is, the joke always is that psychology is largely, you're learning about the psychology of 18-year-olds in intro psych courses, because that's who fills out all the surveys. It may be now that, like, all the psychological data is it's people pretending to be robots, or in some cases, robots pretending to be people, right? They're now M-Turkers who will then generate bots to do their work on M-Turk. So it's completely unclear, like, who's filling out these surveys. In fact, we looked at some of these job hit postings that we couldn't even parse because they weren't for us. We couldn't read them
They weren't
because
human readable.
they weren't human readable.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of I mean, I haven't thought through this part of it fully myself, but there's a kind of macro systems oriented question that seems to be emerging around on the one hand, and this is related to Mechanical Turk, because on the one hand, you have this sort of like by now, I think decades long crowdsourcing of hit-like tasks for labeling training data for various kinds of AI, right? But then on the other hand, you have the more recent emergence of generative AI itself, both capable of producing graphics and language. And then there's this secondary question that I've read a couple of articles about, having to do with the usability of generated content, primarily textual, one would think, but also potentially graphical, as training data for further models or adversarial networks. There's a concern about new kinds of mode collapse or model collapse, resulting from having a ton of language model produced text on the internet, for example. So like, just to give this, to illustrate this for people, like the idea would be like, okay, if we fast forward a decade and 50% of the text on the web is from LLMs, what does it mean to hoover all that up and produce a new model? And there's some pretty credible claims that that's going to produce terrible language models, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, so that's really strange, because what does that do with the status of the like micro task of the human task, right? Like maybe the human Turk workers still have a job because of that problem. It's a very strange, again, I haven't fully thought through that, but it's an interesting problem.
Yeah, that was that was some of the recursion stuff we were looking at, right? And there's lots of different ways that it struck me, I mean, is the idea, and I sarcastically tweeted out a couple of weeks ago, right? In the future, there'll be no writers. There will just be writing teachers. Like that's all we'll be doing is just like, I'm thinking like we have like a professional writing course, and we're thinking like, do we need to have a unit that's actually about writing prompts?
Right.
And prompt writing actually needs to be a thing, right? So in that sense, you have to, if you want AI to generate text, it's probably never going to be seamless, because you don't want it to be, right? Otherwise, it's just going to fall like 3 generations down the line. It's just the Habsburgs at this point, right? And it just collapses under its own centuries of inbreeding. So you're going to need to be there to teach it how to do that, right? So the idea is that humans now will be the artifice, which is also why I like artificial intelligence, right? Like you have the AI and it needs an artifice in order to be, right. Well, that's us, right? Mm-hmm. It won't be because we're doing we will be doing Turk-like tasks, but those Turk-like tasks will be write a poem and then upload the poem to an LLM so that it's got fresh forms to digest.
It's not that fanciful that human labor will be. I'm not designing text or art for other humans primarily. It's I'm doing this. I'm drawing a picture so that the generative AI gets better at drawing pictures, right? It's like my audience is the machine primarily, which is then going to be making the illustrations for what we see. It's like that's a hyperbolic example. It's like that's not a million miles away. And in fact, right now, to me, this is always kind of interesting how these play out tangibly. This is working its way through the court system, through things like companies. Every few days we'll hear about, now George R. Martin has joined a lawsuit against OpenAI saying, hey, you trained on my novels. I deserve at the very least a piece of everything you do. Either stop it or cut me in. So there's this, if that gets traction, and it might, it's like is there a world where like everything you write, you're getting a fraction of a penny because you're just, you know, what's
We're all
that?
I
taught
have
by
to say,
artists.
I mean, I don't know this. I've been involved in the controversy about the copyright to Emily Dickinson's poetry. Believe it or not, despite the fact that she died in 1886, it's still claimed by Harvard University. Totally ridiculous. That's sort of another, not related to AI. But I'm reading these lawsuits. I just like, is he going to sue me if I go to the library, read all his books, and then copy him?
I mean, that's the thing, right? It's what's so, I think, for us interesting is, I mean, there's a sense in which LLMs, when you start describing what they do, it's like trained on a corpus. Yeah, that's, human beings don't come with a full vocabulary plugged in, right? The corpus is babies listen to their parents talk and train on it. And then,
Right.
like, I mean, it's your piece about, and then like, so when we talk, the word that's going to come next is actually somewhat being shaped by the word that comes before it. There's this weird sense in which the way they're learning is, well, what happens if its corpus is full of bias? Right. What I wonder if anybody's ever thought through that problem of what happens if you raise kids on, like, that's not a computer, that's like a social, right? I mean, this is kind of what we like artifice, is actually just acknowledging that it's artifice. It means you could skip all the unhelpful questions about if it's really intelligent and skip to the questions of, what books are you assigning kids to read? Right. Which is a perennial, much more probably important question than, are your kids actually naturally smart? It's like, well, no, are they reading too much Ayn Rand at an early age? And perhaps we should, no one should raise their preschool should not be housed in 4chan.
But this will be an interesting thing because, you know, these cases will tease out, at least in that sphere, things like, well, is ChatGPT like a kid that grows up, right, who's read stuff and is now making their own stuff, or is it, no, it's not like that, right? And, you know, kind of historically, our law tends not to extend those kinds of rights to non-humans. We've talked about it a couple of times. The big exception is the Citizens United, where they said basically money is speech. Corporations have the human right to free speech. But a lot, you know, in American law tends not to extend. It's like, no, I mean, you do things like computers can't have patents, right?
Right. But
AI can't have patents.
I mean, I'm not sure that the arguments about personhood that Nathaniel was developing there are actually really necessary to defend against the kinds of claims that Martin and others are making at present. Yeah. I mean, I think basically you still have some questions about like transformative use and fair use. Yeah. Like this is if I take a copy of something copyrighted and cut up each individual word and put them in a hat and shake them up and draw 5 random words out, like I'm not violating copyright. That I just obviously am not. And that, I mean, unless now, I mean, one thing I've wondered, and I have not read these complaints, and I haven't followed them, frankly, as closely as I've followed some of the complaints against the image generators, which are in some ways more interesting to me. But, you know, I'm wondering, like, are they catching these models producing whole sentences from the Game of Thrones novels verbatim? Because maybe it starts to look as serious a violation as a Xerox machine. I mean, come on. Again, I don't think you need the metaphor of, though interesting though they are, these metaphors of the child or the student or to really defend these technologies. I mean, I think verbatim copying may be a concern. My understanding of how a large language model works is that there's a randomizing procedure that would tend to prevent verbatim copying. But
no, and what you're saying is interesting because in part, right, that's what that in many ways, like thinking through those sort of analogs, one of our interests is like you can't resolve a lot of these complex questions by demonstrating the capacities of the thing doing it. Like but I know it's really human, so now it's a copyright like that. A lot of these systems won't get sorted out by recourse to some. We've now proven that it's like this or it's sentient, and now but that doesn't that doesn't help solve the problem of how much Kenyans are getting paid to moderate hate speech out of, right? Like if so AI, so we proved that ChatGPT is really intelligent. That actually helps us solve none of the problems that we actually would articulate, or the
Right.
It's like, oh, it's a human. Great.
Yeah. I mean, one interesting thing is that the way that, and this also does not, I would say, directly address those, I think, important, concerns about labor politics that are going to be central to a discussion of Mechanical Turk. But the experience, the sort of cultural experience that we've all had together of playing with these with these large language models and other sort of AI toys is, it does change, I think, among other things, the way that our students think about writing, not just in a sort of like, ooh, can I like cheat by just having ChatGPT write this essay, but I mean, okay, so right now this semester I'm teaching a class I do lately every fall semester, which is sort of an introduction to literary theory. And we're doing like the expectable stuff, including against theory. I just taught The Death of the Author, that famous Roland Barthes essay. And when we do this sort of like bread and butter structuralist, post-structuralist stuff now, I mean, I think a lot of students are thinking about ChatGPT while we talk about language as a kind of structure and a tissue of quotations, to use Barth's term for the act of writing or of weaving together a text. And at one point, I said to them, like, look, if you really think about it, what do you have to do to get an A in this class? You don't actually have to understand the material. All you have to do is string together words in such an order that when submitted to me, they cause me to give you an A. Now, unfortunately for them, the easiest way to do that is probably to understand the material and let that guide which words they put together. But I think it's actually some of these, frankly, very old and very influential post-structuralist insights about the nature of language and maybe the nature of thought get a kind of direct illustration thanks to these large language models that sort of has the effect of I don't know, it's almost like a defamiliarization of something that helps students to think through what might otherwise be pretty counterintuitive.
Yeah. I think Ted Underwood wrote, I think, has a blog post about basically like LLMs are like, post-structuralism, right? Like that's how that turns out they were basically, like, it was more complicated, but basically like they were right.
Matthew Kirschenbaum has tweeted about this sort of in relation to the against theory stuff too. That sort of is my the very simple version of my take for that critical inquiry cluster online was like, yo, Derrida was right, and ChatGPT is the proof, and I actually sort of stand by that. It's been very interesting to teach Knapp and Michaels and John Searle's work after thinking through the sort of derivative take on ChatGPT.
It would also be fun to map on critiques, because you see, right? I mean, a lot of the critiques are, well, it doesn't have meaning because meaning is linked to intent, and intent is secured by right. It's like,
yeah. This is a little in the weeds, but like, I've been teaching, again, these sort of separate paths for me, like the literary stuff and the AI thing. In the AI class, I've been teaching the Chinese room article for years, right? Just because it's a super influential way of exploring this question of like, well, is machine or computational consciousness even possible? And as I've taught it more and more, like, I know that there's stuff that's been written on this, and I just haven't read enough about it, but in that article itself anyway, Searle over and over again punts by making reference to the causal structure of the brain. And he basically says it's the causal structure of the brain that produces intention, right? Like that's sort of the line of thinking there. And my students and I every year were like, what is the causal structure of the brain? Like, what does that mean? And I know that there are people who've written about the reception of the Chinese room and about Searle's thought in relation to this specific question, but it's exactly this, right? I mean, and I think, like, I mean, it even sort of goes to what Jeremy was saying around like what's it like to be human, experiences of trauma, and these sorts of things. And like, I start to, as you're saying that, I was like, I don't know, like there's a lot of total sociopaths in the world who I think are, and even I think I'm sort of faking it sometimes. Like, I don't think I'm a sociopath or whatever. And like, I know what it is to feel pain for sure. But like, sometimes I'm just sort of faking it and like saying words that hopefully do the right thing. And, like to some extent, I feel like I'm sort of like I'm modeling or I'm responding to my model of human affect and of human behavior. And so, again, this sort of line of thinking that started with my students in ChatGPT, it leads me to wonder, like, well, what really is the nugget of the human, the causal structure of the brain, or whatever that isn't sort of can't be debrided away by these various technologies?
Yeah. Plus, there's whole discourses. I have a grad student working on non-representational thought about pain, because it actually turns out having people tell you how they feel is actually it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
And it's framed by the scale that you give them, right? So even like the simple question of how do you feel is like, well, who do you mean by you?
Right.
I can tell you how I think I'm feeling.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, of course, we're all that's why the meaning of it's like half the shit I say, I'm surprised by where the sentence ends from where I start. I get to the end and it's not at all clear. I came out of my mouth, but I'm not. Typically, probably it's a late '90s episode of Seinfeld said it, but that's the LLM I've been trained on, where everything I say sounds like it's a setup for a joke that's coming. So no one believes that I'm actually a sincere individual, but that's my own burden to bear.
Yeah. I think this sort of goes in two directions. There's this on the one hand, as you're saying, the kind of insight about or cluster of insights about the algorithmicness of language or of any representational project, and maybe broadly of reason or of intelligence. And on the other hand, to go back to something that Jeremy mentioned much earlier, there's this, like, it is the case that we're like embodied mammals, and there are sort of things about what it is like to I'm sort of making the qualia argument here, I guess, but like things about what it is like to be a human mammal, and maybe even actually to have the causal structure of the brain that is a human brain, I don't know, I'm not sure, like I guess I don't have a full sense of, like, is that the non-artificial or the pre-artificial? And like, does it have any interpretive status? Like, I think the answer to that is maybe no. But it clearly informs things like how we actually feel, whether we talk about write about it or not. And there are consequences to that.
One of the things we've been thinking about is sort of what are sort of, not maybe, I guess, synonyms for artifice. So one is, we've been looking a lot at, I read a lot of Timothy Ingold's sort of anthropology, and he's got this notion of the taskscape. Even as you were describing, right, I'm thinking of von Uexküll's Umwelt as another kind of like artifice, like the thing in which, right, which is interesting because it's linked to the sensing capacities of a particular organism. But even those capacities have to meet, to borrow from Karen Barad, right? They got to meet the universe halfway, right? There's some relation out of which that thing emerges. And then also, I think something you were talking about earlier, I was just talking to a student about this, is in William James's, 2-volume tome on psychology, he's got a chapter on instinct. And the argument he makes is that what human beings mistake as thoughtful action is actually because we have way more instincts than most other animals. And we have counter instincts. And so we have so many instincts that they get in each other's way. And in the pause of their instincts getting in the way, but that thoughtful action it's because we're over instinctual.
That's an interesting way of like, maybe that's what thought is.
It's the pause it's created by the agonism of instinct, right? Like flight or fight.
Right.
Well, those two hit each other, and in that split second, I go, well, maybe I could.
Yeah, you start talking about it, and that's
right. Yeah. which
does he actually frame it as amount of instinct or complexity?
something I forget now, but basically he's at least he's working against the argument that whatever the difference is between humans and other animals, it's not more or less instinct. And so then he starts linking it to, it's partially also right that some of those instincts we have are cultural or historical or right. So he builds all these things, but to a certain extent, right, he starts with this kind of qualitative framework, because the argument he's making is that people will make the qualitative argument that human beings are less instinctual. And so what he's trying to do is which is interesting when you link that to why you still need Turks to identify stop signs, is like if human beings are actually covered in sensors, right? You can make the argument that partially one of the reasons that like if the brain is where it all stops, the brain probably got as big as it did to make sense of the fact that we're just open wounds in the world, right? Whereas lots of other animals only have a few, right? Like we've got eyes and ears and proprioception, and the skin is feeling and the hair is, so there's a sense in which there's all those competing, sensory impingement, and we get paralyzed, and while we're paralyzed, we have thoughts.
Yeah. I'm curious about I guess my other synonyms for artificial. I mean, the one that I immediately go to is like culture or cultural.
Yeah.
But also what is its counterparty, right? I mean, I earlier sort of spoke in a way that assumed that the other of artifice was the natural. But I guess there could be other.
You also mentioned intuitive, which I had not thought of, but I think is a really interesting way to think about that, which is interesting because then your example is like how much artifice is involved to make an iPhone feel intuitive,
right?
Like how much work you have to do to make something natural. It's like I was reading a book about style, and if you're aiming for clarity, get ready to work. Yeah,
I mean, and this is there's a whole history of this obviously in computational and technological design, but in AI specifically. I mean, you can read the imagined dialogues of the Turing test and its those who riff on it as being as about deliberating the intuitive, like the Washington Post piece that I wrote about computers. Like I open with this by observing that. So Turing famously, asks the imagined AI to write him a poem, and the computer says no. Like I was never one for poetry. And what's really smart about that imagined response is that it's very intuitive. As I say in the piece, that's exactly what my dad would say if I asked him to write a poem. Right? He would just be like, "No, I suck at writing poems. I'm not doing it." And there's, that opens a space for, and this gets opened in a lot of contexts with iPhones. I mean, I don't know how many times I saw Steve Jobs say it just works on a stage somewhere in the Bay Area, right? And the whole idea of, that Macs and other Apple products don't need user manuals because how to use them should be and maybe is intuitive, right? There's the imagination of the intuitive in really technological design is like really deep, and that would be right. Like that, I still kind of think that if there were general artificial intelligence, it would show itself by being like fully conversationally capable in a way that was as intuitive as conversing with you two. Right. Yeah. Like there is something about the idea of the kind of, it just works. It just goes.
Right. You wouldn't know. What's interesting too, because I'm also imagining like Macs, in addition to like not coming with user manuals, have like, I got a new laptop. It's got one right. It's also like they're self-sealing, like they're literally impossible to, right. If you think about if people like the way you'd fix recursion is ideally you'd never need to open it again. And so Macs are like they're literally seamless in their design, right? There's no way to note where it began and end. Where some computers, you're like, oh, there's a screw on the back. That's where you fix it. And so Macs are literally like it's self-sealing. There's no edges, right? It's all buffed and
And when it's like its battery is dead. What now? It's like, well, you get a new one. Don't bother. It's like this is a difficult problem.
Yeah.
But that kind of Seth, do you see it then and maybe this isn't a fair question, but would you see this then as being steeped in language? I mean, you say, well, I would expect conversation with the machine as being kind of like the threshold. Do you see that as steeped in language?
So one of the questions that I kind of wrote down for myself as I was thinking about this chat with you guys was like, why does human intelligence seem so natural to me? And I'm like pretty darn sold on a lot of the arguments that I've made and that I've been teaching lately about everything from, you know, specific literary genres to structures of languages to structures of like rational thinking as being like thinkable as various kinds of artifice. And as in some broad sense technological. So how, like, what does it mean then that it is still is the case that like interacting with other people feels and maybe needs to feel I guess I want to say sort of natural or sort of intuitive. And I guess another way of putting that would be that like, and I'm using here words that I would really prefer not to use, like truly, but from a standpoint of intellectual commitment, I'd rather not be saying something like this. But what I'm going to say is like, any social interaction I have feels more authentic if it feels also to be more intuitive or natural. I mean, like all three of those words, I'm like, ugh, right? In part because the sort of notion of the constructedness of the social and of language and of intellectual, you know, I mean, all of this is like very much.
So here's a thought. I mean, this is also maybe going back to our original, right? So as two rhetoricians, I wouldn't say rhetors because we're not particularly good at it.
No.
Is that also what rhetoric brings is it's not embarrassed by artifice, but it also, I think, potentially brings that what we mean finally by natural or intuitive is we're not defining some status of it. What we're really doing is essentially marking a successful performance.
Right.
Like what we mean by natural is really good artifice.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, like, ugh.
But I know.
That's like, I think, I want to call that fascist, actually. Like, I actually think that,
wouldn't be the first time.
I'm immediately thinking of like Benjamin and Brecht. And like what they think about the politics of art and performance, and I think they would think of that as a fascist move. I mean, I don't mean to call you fascist, of course, but like,
well, because then I would just hit him back with my boy Jacques.
Oh well, okay.
Like, you know, right? It's the organizing, but I mean, right? Well, I mean, that's ultimately right where particularly why Platonism won't die. Is because rhetoric will basically admit that like things work out because they're persuasive, not because they've got any kind of inherent right. These are everything philosophy wants to is. Rhetoric comes and says, actually, that's an ought. Like, show me your work.
Yes.
So often I've the defense against fascism, which who doesn't want to marshal is great, is sometimes ends up being, well, they're just wrong. And wrongness should be enough to win the day. And then I just want to hand them a history book and say, like, good luck. Because by the way, doing something because you imagine your opponent is just fundamentally wrong doesn't also not generally piles of bodies.
Right.
So it's,
I mean, but I think, you know, it's also it leads back to some of these questions that this sort of line of thinking, which could be thought of as like a rhetorical pragmatics, I think, leads back to some questions about like the givens of human embodiment and of human cognition, if there are any. In so much as like if you're you know effect oriented. This is again something that I talk about with my literary theory students when we talk about, you know, are we interested in like aesthetics understood as thinking about how different texts and other works of art sort of affect an audience, right? Is it, you know, is it the case that there might be, you know, discoverable brain structures that explain why certain things look beautiful or are funny, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to what extent can we or should we you know, view the rhetorical task as a I mean, it's weird because you can call that a manipulative project, right? But I would almost want to call it manipulative in a not derogatory way, or not necessarily derogatory
Right.
way.
In the same way that we want to carve out some space for artificial as not, right? I mean, the manipulation and artifice then start to get linked in some, right? What could artifice be but manipulation of some kind, right? And
some of the more compelling AI narratives. So I've alluded to this AI class that I teach every spring lately, and you know, we read philosophy of mind, and we read the Turing test article and so forth, but also we look at like a couple of or a Ted Chiang story, and you know, some movies, you know, like and you know, often like a component of, or let's say maybe even actually just an iteration of the like Turing test thought experiment is the one that thinks about the AI conversational agent as in some way not necessarily duplicitous but manipulative, right? And this is a trope that's like everywhere. This is central to Nick Bostrom's ideas about why AI might be dangerous. I mean, like one of the scariest things he says is like, as soon as these things get smarter than us, they can control us, right? Precisely in the way that we, you know, we may be able to control, I don't know, people who aren't as smart as we are, or like certainly animals who are not as cognitively capable as we are. And that's, you know, Ex Machina is like this. Arguably, Her is like the, you know, there's a lot of there's a question about like the status of manipulation in the Terminator 2, I think, you know, so like there's a lot of sort of narratives where that idea of achieving a certain kind of rhetorical effect as a measure of intelligence that is artificial, right? That's a nice way of thinking about artifice.
I mean, we're hoping that there's some, I mean, our wager is that engaging that term opens up some new terrain for this conversation, which I think can too quickly get reduced to if we could just establish the ontological status of ChatGPT, we'd be done and dusted. We would, you know, when I think they're just much, and also I think they're just much more interesting questions than Also, her is heartbreaking as the most. I think putting her in the lineage of Terminator and Matrix, it's a machine apocalypse film, but it's the most disturbing because in all the others we're somehow still central, right? The machines are mad at us. Matrix needs us for batteries. Her is just like we're all sad Joaquin Phoenixes and we get dumped.
Yeah, well, that's a human problem, my friend.
Right, because we're just not. We're just not interesting. Like it's the most apocalyptic because you realize humanity is being dumped. We're not important. They don't need us. They're not mad at us. They don't want to control us. They're just having many more conversations and apparently more orgasms. And
maybe being dumped is a human experience.
Yes. And Joaquin Phoenix is just walking around with his high-waisted pants, writing greeting cards for a living. It's just we're not all that interesting at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Well, and
we're at an hour and we've.
I mean, I'd like to say one thing, like by way of follow up, because Nathaniel, you kind of got me thinking about your sort of last comments about rhetoric in relation to the artificial. Like, have kind of brought me back to some of those notes that you emailed me and about like what is the status of the artificial. I mean, I think that like the little rhetoric in the sense of instructions for oratory that I've read and thought about. I mean, like the status of the artificial within that kind of a context is really interesting because on the one hand, there's obviously like to be rhetorically persuasive or otherwise efficacious is necessarily artifice. There's technique, but on the other hand, one needs to be one needs to not seem too artificial, right? At a certain level, that like the technique of not seeming too fake is like,
oh god, what's the name for that? It's there's an Italian I forget. There's
Spezzatura?
There we go.
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is the problem of not just of every chatbot, but also like every politician. And you know, it's like it's a central problem. And I think actually, like, you can even think through what is meant by artificial intelligence in those terms, which is that, like, it's really interesting to me that the again, that sort of supplemental work that the Turkers are doing is often. Now, it's interesting to me that you all have found some counterexamples of this, but like, I think the paradigmatic examples are like, it's actually very mechanical, sort of like click on the stop sign, like look for duplicates in this data set. You know, it's not like, oh, tell me how you feel about, like, you know, global warming, or you know, it's not generally, I think, at least, this sort of deeply qualitative, write me a poem, deeply humanly authentic kind of work. It's actually artificial in the sense of feeling a bit stilted, right? It's these little chunky, quite mechanical jobs to give a human brain. And so that there too, like the way that this idea of rhetoric, of the artificiality of rhetoric cuts into that, into that doubling of artificial is pretty interesting, actually.
That's something we've been thinking about. Is, you know, I think maybe last time we were dealing with the issue of what do we have to contribute to this discourse, and who are we talking to, right? Who's our audience for this? Are we, you know, kind of preaching to the converted here and speaking to other rhetoricians, or, you know, and what is it that we do? It's kind of why I was kind of interested in that dialogue about language, you know, is what rhetoric can do something like examine those terms. When we use artificial, what's the presumptive obverse that's embedded in this particular case, right? Because it's possible that it's not shared, for example, right? I mean, they have different notions of, when you say artificial intelligence, what do you see as the opposite of that? You know, and you're probably not consciously aware of that. It's a, you know, embedded notion of this is the obverse of that. You know, if maybe we can look at things, is that something that rhetoric can bring to this? Is not answering the question of, you know, what is artificial? It's, well, what does that mean in this case, right? What are its, upon what does it rest? What's its obverse? Where is that coming from? You know, is that a rhetorical question to answer?
Yeah. It's a question about rhetoric.
That uses rhetoric. Yeah. It's Simpsons, and I can't find it, which means I probably smashed a few things together, where Lisa retorts to, she says, is that a rhetorical question? And she says, yes, it uses rhetoric. I cannot find that in the scripts. There's some things that are close. I have a vivid memory of this happening. Yeah. You know, speaking of LLMs, I'm just a, you know, mishmash of Simpsons quotes. So I think I just put this one together. You'd be a fun. I mean, Seth. I mean, one common refrain on this intellectual endeavor, and Jeremy and I's longstanding friendship, is he might be the most successful Turing test entry ever. I mean, you might actually, still out. Yeah, he's not sure either, which I think is how can it not? What's that? How can it not know what it is? Is something you might put on Jeremy's tombstone. Okay, well, I threw Jeremy under the bus, which normally means that's our time. That's our time. Seth, this was fantastic. I have very much notes. I ran out of space to write notes, so I wrote notes on a parking ticket envelope that I have on my desk. It was great to chat with you guys. Really enjoyed it. Yeah. So we'll, I don't know, we'll check back in. Maybe you'll see where we'll go with this. Yeah. I can't wait to see what you guys write.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and thanks for joining us, and have a good rest of your Friday. And yeah, we'll see you on the internet.
You too. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Bye,
you
Seth.
so much. Okay.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gives us some productive ways to go. I mean, I was kind of interested, I was taking in some of my notes here, and I don't know if this is meaningful, but it's like, does it make sense? Because we talked previously, although maybe a lot of this has gotten jettisoned, about looking at some different things. Like we have a file with just like, here are Turk-like things, be
Yeah.
my eyes. And I was like, does it make sense to look at some cases and to
Yeah,
analyze the artifice within them, right? It's like, what is
That-
artifice here? What is artifice there? What are we talking
Yeah.
about when we say it?
because that originally was kind of our at least early on idea for this third piece, is that we would then look at, right, this is when we were looking at
Cultural
the sort
techniques?
of the cultural techniques, right? Are there, but yeah, what is the across all of these different things, right? Because there's potentially a risk in, we don't want to define what artifice is either. It for much the same probably instinct as defining intelligence.
Yeah.
So not only what is intelligence in any given arrangement, but how is the artifice itself articulated in any given? Yeah.
I mean, it's an option. And I mean, I think the difficulty is you're touching upon, there's always, it's like, well, if we can't come to, what's the impulse there is always, what's the commonality? What's the kernel of artifice that we see? The same thing you do with intelligence or anything. And the difficulty is, it's like, I don't want to do that.
Right. We don't want a kernel.
But at the same time, it's like, well, then what are you doing? If there's nothing generally that can be extrapolated from this, then what is this other than just a completely idiosyncratic statement about what this is, right? Or was, or whatever? It's like, well, here's what this was. It's like, but what's the utility of that?
Yeah.
Unless there's something that can go beyond just that. I mean,
I mean, maybe that
I don't
comes
know.
back to, and I gotta hop off here soon. But the notion of case studies is potentially the way around that, right? So that we're both looking at these particular things, but modeling how to engage that particularity becomes the takeaway.
Yeah.
That there's something methodological that's being offered here.
Yeah. Something that you can do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll do our show, and then there's a play at home version of it.
Yeah.
Mechanical Turks, the board game.
Well, I mean, hypothetically, then it establishes, if you call that the work of theory, it's like, well, this is what you're doing. You're theorizing these. This is what the practice is, or practice of it. All righty.
Okay. Well, that was great.
Yeah. We'll have to make sure to thank him and add him to the credits.
Yes.
I'll do that.
Okay. Well, I will see you next time.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
See ya.